I will not include this in the show if you don't want, but I have to just bring this up because I know that our listeners will take great delight in my embarrassed squirming. But when I emailed you about being on the podcast, you responded very graciously, said you're willing to do it. And I didn't expect you to listen to any of our past episodes because I figured you're a busy guy, you got a lot going on. But it seems you did at least listen to the episode where we read that article from the Defector Mag by Nick Zarzicki and talked about the interview. And you sent me such a nice email where you were like, hey, listen to that episode. Can you answer, like, is Chad a compliment or is it an insult? I just don't know. And the beet red that I turned when I saw that in my inbox, I'm like, oh no, Richard Garfield, I was so horribly embarrassed to have to explain that it was a compliment, 100% a compliment that, you didn't make the fact that you designed Magic your entire personality and just, become that the only thing you ever did. You kind of had a whole life beyond it and, weren't completely consumed by it.
Well, when you explained that, that made sense from the context, and certainly I could tell from listening it that you guys obviously love Magic in particular and games in general, and it was nice to hear your feedback on that article, and then I listened to one other episode just to sort of get the gist of what the podcast was about. But yeah,
that's very kind of you. It's more than a lot of guests do when they come on here, so I really appreciate it. And nothing but compliments.
Thank you.
Man, the idea. Oh, geez, I just. Whew. I'm going to introduce Anthony, and we'll talk for about 2 minutes, and then I'll introduce you, and we'll just get to it.
Okay.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony Maddox, BFA.
That is accurate. I do have a bachelor's in fine arts.
You ever think about that? It's weird. Like, it's a weird combination of words. Like, I don't think of myself ever as having been a fine artist.
No, honestly, I don't think about my degree ever, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't really either. It's definitely just a thing that it happened, but it's not defining to who we are at all in any way. But, fine art school, that's what we did. But I'm mentioning your credentials, of course, Anthony, because we have a special guest on this episode, maybe the most special guest of all time. We are joined by someone who needs absolutely no introduction. It is the designer of Magic the Gathering, Richard Garfield, all the way from Australia. Hi, Richard.
Hi. It's good to be here. Always fun to talk about games.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. This is really exciting for us. Obviously, Magic is a big part of our lives. We love the game, but I think we love it in a different way than a lot of people do. We pretty much exclusively design and play cubes here in our local playgroup and ourselves personally. And we like Magic because it's a venue for us to, experiment and play with game design. So thank you for making such a beautiful system that allows us to, be creative and design kind of our own games within the game of Magic more broadly.
No, I love that. I'm constantly interested in players taking ownership of their gameplay rather than prescribed to sort of the publishers or some central authority. And cubes are an excellent expression of that, since they are mostly homebrewed.
It sounds like you've been that way since a young age. There was an anecdote in this recent interview with you on the Defector magazine where you mentioned that you had modified the Stratego game pieces when you were like age 8. Where did that sort of desire to modify games come from? How did you come to that so young?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure what the answer is. I don't, even though I did that with Stratego, I don't think it really became a passion of mine until I found Dungeons and Dragons, and I like to credit that with making me a game designer. It sort of first of all, it piqued my interest in that it was so orthogonal to any game I had ever seen, and I began to wonder what else was possible with games. But also, it really puts both the players and especially the game master in the position where they're designing games, and, as I mentioned earlier, taking responsibility for their own game experience.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I feel like I like to make the comparison between a game designer and a cube curator, because both are sort of in this role where you're hosting this experience and deciding how everybody is going to play. Is that something that you see similarly?
Absolutely, and I think it's sort of a continuum. you can have a very packaged, constrained environment, which allows you to curate your play experience, but and then you can get more and more freedoms and more tools until you're actually designing games fresh. And cubes are a really nice place because there's there's so many possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see that whole spectrum from just curating with limited sets of cards all the way to, well, now I start wanting to design custom cards and really go off the rails.
In the case of Caleb Gannon, I mean, that literally, he designed a cube, got really invested in that, had it on Magic Online for a while, and then just kind of kept following that to custom cards all the way to making his own card game, Algomancy. So, yeah, I think that it's a great sort of entry point into thinking about games from a design perspective instead of just purely optimizing them as a player. And it never really occurred to me that, Dungeons & Dragons is kind of the original game system, right? Like, there's a lot of structure, but there's very little, prescriptive structure. It's like, here's a set of things you can use however you want, as opposed to sit down, read the rule book, and just play through it, step by step.
Yeah. One of the things that I've used in game design a lot is this idea also that tweaking games, you mentioned modifying Stratego. Well, as I said, it didn't really become something I did a lot of until I got into game design through Dungeons and Dragons. But after that point, I really became passionate about it. And for example, I love chess variants, and we would take games that we had sort of finished exploring, but then make it so. I remember one particular game involved piracy, and so we're getting a little bored of it, and so we started adding poker to it. Like every time somebody would get to the home port, we'd play a game of poker, and that's kind of interesting because we know poker, we know this game, and poker without stakes is often boring, but this had stakes because it was within this big metagame. Anyway, you can take these games and you can tweak them, and sometimes what you end up with is not enduring. You're not going to play it more than once, but it's almost always interesting the first time. It gives you the opportunity to break something or to explore something new.
Chess is such a great example of a game that on its face is not ostensibly a game system, right? It's one game, you put the pieces in a certain configuration, there's one win condition, but it does lend itself so cleanly to being modified and riffed on. There are so many great chess variants out there that just, take the rule set of, here are pieces that can move in a certain way, now let's change the shape of the board, change the win condition, change the configuration of the pieces, and it works really nicely for that.
I every once in a while I get back into it. I find what digital versions are available of different variations of chess, and I've got this book of this encyclopedia of chess variations, which has, I don't know, I want to say a couple thousand chess variations, and I've read it front to back twice and gone through with highlighters, highlighting all the ones I was interested in. It's just so much fun exploring the different ways which people can tweak that system or any system, but chess is particularly modifiable. Poker is too. There's tons of poker variations.
Just because I know people are going to want to know, have you by any chance played the latest craze Balatro?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I killed Balatro. I loved it. I was really impressed with their focus on gameplay. There's a lot of games where, I don't know, they don't seem to have confidence in their gameplay because they want to draw out the animations or something. So they don't let the player take control of the pace, I guess might be the way to describe it. But Balatro, you can make it go really fast, and you just get this constant hit of game design, gameplay, and they even had the hotkey for restarting. I loved it to death. I think it's a great.
It sounds
design.
Dangerous a little bit.
That's really cool. There's a good friend of mine made this really interesting chess variation, which I think of all the time as one of my favorite chess riffs, which was a roguelike that used chess rules. So every level was like a grid of a different configuration, and you had your pieces, which could be arranged in any way and in any combination of different types of pieces, and then the AI had their own pieces as well. And so like every level was like a puzzle basically that used the chess rules to manage the relationships between the pieces, and was just really brilliant. I love some of these little riffs on known games like that.
I played a few chess roguelikes, which I think there's a bigger game waiting to be found there because there's a bunch of little ones. One of my chess variations was I did this back when I was with Wizards, and what we did was we had a stack of cards, and you would draft them, and they were chess pieces. And so you might draft a queen, you might draft a rook, you might draft a fairy piece like a rook that can move also like a knight. You might draft some weird pawn that can move in any direction, so it's kind of like a king. But you also might draft action cards like like take two moves, or one of my favorites was an extra 30 seconds on the clock. So you're looking at, it's like, well, should I get an extra knight, or should I get 30 seconds on my clock?
Sure, yeah.
And it was amazing fun. Its big flaw, though, was, which I've been thinking about it recently some, but its big flaw was that every time you played, you really enjoyed the draft and the play was very interesting, but then it would always end on a stupid mistake, which is kind of a letdown because there's just too much going on. Yeah.
That actually brings me to a question I really wanted to ask you, which something we talk about on the show a lot is complexity, because we're designing cubes, and in Anthony, in my case, we have a local play group here that is a pretty broad range of people in terms of their investment in Magic and their relationship to the game. And so we found that, as the game has gotten older, obviously cards have gotten more complex for good reasons, right? Like the game just is running out of simple design space, having 25,000 cards at this point, and there's a lot of digital play now, which means that you have a rules engine managing things for you, so you can afford to have some more complexity that kind of just becomes smooth and easy when you're actually playing with the cards. But for us who are playing in paper, it's something I think is really important to be conscious of as a cube designer. And I'm curious to know, when you're designing any game, how do you know when it's gotten too complex, or how do you manage that complexity?
Well, it's going to be a sliding scale depending on what you're trying to do. But I've become more and more sensitive over the years to complexity, and I spend a lot of time trying to simplify things. But that said, there's I've got this game, Founders of Ravik, which is meant to explore this economic system in radical markets. And of course, there, my sensitivity to complexity will be very different than when I made a dice game for Amigo. And recently, I've actually begun to wonder whether I've gone too far towards honing, because I should say that one valuable way to look at it is that you've got this complexity budget. This is really how I usually analyze it. And your budget is different for different games. So my complexity budget in Founders of Ravik I felt like it was pretty high.
Yeah.
In a trading card game, it'll also be relatively high, but when I'm making a sort of family game, it'll be lower. And then anytime I've got this mechanic, I look at it as a cost, and I see what it's doing, and I try to see whether it justifies that cost.
Yeah, it's honestly just really validating to hear you say this, because it's really similar, I think, to how we talk about Cube a lot, where it's like, depending on your audience, depending on who your play group is for, yeah, you might be able to sustain a lot of complexity and it might be worth it, but often, if you're going to have new players involved, you want to make sure that you're adjusting your budget accordingly. And it's also really interesting to hear about this Founders of Ravik game, that it's deliberately being very complex because it's trying to explore this real world proposal, which you just can't necessarily model that in a simple way because it is a complex idea.
Yeah, that's right. And during the course of that, of course, I did still exercise simplifications because I would come up with a structure and try to figure out whether it's really vital to what it is I'm trying to do, whether it pays for itself. And knowing your standards is also really important. You can have two things which are equally complex, and one of them can be a lot easier, de facto a lot less complex, because people already know how it works.
Sure, yeah,
and
right.
So you've got things like I'm not a fan of like first player markers in games. I'll use them, I put them in my game, and I'm okay with them, but it's like always like this thing which seems just a little complex, and if I can get rid of it, I really want to, because I don't like tracking who's the first player. But it's very cheap also because it's so common, right? So
Sure.
it's like there have been times where I've been having trouble and I introduce it, and it just might clean up the problems, and it is really very low cost in a lot of ways. But it's not because it's low cost intrinsically; it's because just everybody knows how it works.
I like what you said about this chess card game, that one of the flaws is that it always ends in someone making, in hindsight, a stupid mistake. That's one of the things I feel like I have been sensitive to on my own cube complexity. I feel like my cube has gotten complex enough that even pretty experienced players are making...
What, like try and reanimate a creature with protection from black, for example?
Sure, Anthony may have tried to put Animate Dead on a chroma this past Tuesday. That's fine. We've all been there before. But yeah, even when experienced players are making mistakes like that, that's when I'm kind of like sensitive to that complexity. And I think it is a hard line to figure out, because I think some people would look at a mistake like that I make a bunch of, Anthony makes, other experienced players make, and just say like, get good, skill issue, like, stop messing up. But as a cube designer, we have the unique privilege and kind of responsibility to, look at those things and say that might not actually be just a failing of the player to strategize correctly and, understand their options, but instead just a failure of the game to present too many things to keep track of at a given time. And everyone's got a limit somewhere.
Yeah, and chess. The draft chess was way over, and it's easy to see that. And Magic has enough going on with. Just looked it up. Is it really 30,000 cards? I saw somebody
nearly
say
30,000.
Right.
Yeah,
it's a lot.
In the last couple of years, that's been a real hockey stick.
Yeah. Anyway, there's plenty of room there to make something which is too complex. And with Magic, presumably, you make a cube like that. If you're going to stick with the same cube, you can probably make it work with the same group.
Right.
One of the problems with the chess draft thing is that, of course, people wanted to draft every time, so you never got to know stuff. And with Magic, you want to change cubes every once in a while, and so maybe there's not enough time to learn how to play it at the right level.
There definitely are, I know, some play groups out there that are just kind of a fixed small group of people. There's not a lot of people rotating in and out. And I think they do have a lot higher tolerance for complexity, and probably a much different like local meta game when you're drafting the same cube with the same 8 people every week. It's going to be a lot different than us, who, we have upwards of like 30 plus cubes in our play group here in Baltimore. And so every Tuesday, it's like a couple different cubes are out there and a couple different people from this big group are out there. So it's definitely not consistent enough that we can get people acquainted to the complexity of a more sophisticated environment.
A long time ago, I began to look at game players as being divided up into honers and explorers, innovators. And the innovators loved to learn new games and explore the strategies in them. The honers loved to really perfect them, get the edge correct. And of course, people are generally a mix, and it took me a while to realize, but there's also other things going on besides that. But that dichotomy does help sometimes with understanding what's going on. So you can have, an environment of honers who play the same cube and get a lot of pleasure out of that. And
right.
Your group could be more oriented towards wanting to do the innovation, which will involve switching things up more often. And neither is intrinsically better, of course. It's what people enjoy doing. And that's actually a good place to mention that the article that said I know where things went wrong with Magic, that's certainly overstating how I feel about Magic.
Sure.
I think standard tournament play and constructed, I think it's amazing, and I think there's a reason why it appealed to so many people so deeply.
Yeah.
But the problem is, of course, that is just at a certain level. At a certain point, you're appealing very much to the honers, and there's a lot of other players out there, and it's leaving those behind that. And players have taken such steps towards fixing that with cubes and commander formats and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting to mention, and that makes sense to me that is such a big reason why Commander became so big, was this population of players that just wanted a more creative expression. And for me, that's why I really love Cube, is I feel like it does kind of touch both of those a lot, in that as a cube designer, or as somebody who's playing other cubes that people are designing, it is a lot of opportunity for novelty, while at the same time I do get to sit down and try to play well every time.
Yeah, no, I think it's marvelous. It's my favorite way to play is a cube, and I've always responded well to the drafts. I think it took me a long time to admit it, but I don't really like freely creating decks. I've kind of enjoyed it from time to time, but it's just too much work. But drafting, oh, I love it.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir here for sure. I definitely feel like the catering to the honing audience is especially exacerbated by, the internet and the communication age, right? Part of the reason that I never got into constructed Magic was, building a deck felt like a lot of work, but more so it felt like I didn't want to play constructed if I was just going to be basically picking up somebody else's deck list and piloting it. I wanted the creativity of building my own deck, and it wasn't that building any deck was hard. It felt like the monumental task of building a competitive deck myself was like something that was just beyond my reach, given how many people are out there grinding on Magic Online or, playing with Pro Tour testing teams and like trying to find the best decks. And here I am just like a guy in my basement. It just felt out of reach to me. And so Cube is where I found that same, satisfaction where I can still play in this space.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, and this is of course changed the more the internet became a factor, which of course it was a big factor in Magic from the very beginning, but it became a competitive factor more and more through the Pro Tour. That aspect of net decking, it didn't bother me at first, and it still doesn't bother me in the sense that there's a lot of players who get a lot of satisfaction and they are happy to take a boilerplate deck and just tweak it a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, my preference in play is always to try to bring something new to the game. And when I would play constructed, therefore I would not use a net deck. And while I think that a lot of the decks I would make had competitive possibilities, it's really, really hard to beat a deck which has been honed down so well. So even if you've got an excellent alternative, there's a lot of work going in which you may not want to do to make that actually competitive. It could be better, right? You could have a better framework for a deck, but the meta has sort of found this local maximum. It's a lot of work, very rewarding for some people.
Yeah, and to your point, there's a lot of players out there that are not like me or you and are just happy to pick up a deck that's a known quantity and learn how to play it and get good at, honing the experience of piloting that deck. That's just not me.
Yeah.
I want to make my own deck every time. That's what's fun about it for me.
Yeah. Yep.
You mentioned that Cube is your preferred way to play. I know there's people out there that just really want to know, what is your relationship to Cube? Do you have your own? Do you play others somewhat frequently?
No, I don't play very often. When I get back into Magic, I usually set up a cube, and then that's what I play. I have been out of touch though for I've got twin 6-year-olds, so about 6 years ago, 8 years ago maybe, and about 8 or 9 years ago was the last time I worked with Wizards, and usually when I work with Wizards, that would get me into the game, and I would set up a cube and begin playing that. And I would also play constructed within whatever we were working on, which is a very different experience, of course, because there you don't have net decks.
Exactly.
Everybody's sort of going into it fresh and trying to figure out how this new system works. So it's appealing to the innovator in me.
I've thought a couple times about how fun it sounds to be on I think it's called the Future League at WotC, where they're just internally for cards that haven't been released, like trying to see if they can flesh out a little bit of what that meta will look like when the cards are actually in Standard. And that sounds like the ideal way to play Magic to me. If you could somehow bottle that experience and make it available to more than just the few hundred people in the research and development department, I think it'd be fantastic.
But I think isn't that part of the challenge that once you scale that up, and you make the pond bigger, then you're just going to have other people solving that problem much quicker.
Yeah.
So it's like, I mean, again, I just want to point it back to Cube to say, like, it's a way to create a smaller pond where we can have that creative exploration and discovery for the first time.
Yeah, the cube might be the best. It certainly doesn't translate that experience. It doesn't. I wouldn't count it as the bottling that, but it is the closest thing I can think of. But yeah. Their Future League is very exciting. I suppose you could. I don't know. Does anybody take the concept of cube but use it for constructed rather than draft?
Some people will do sort of like different constructed formats where they'll pick, say, 5 or 6 random sets and say, for this month, this is our league where we're just building from this pool. I haven't seen exactly where it's like a curated cube style, though.
I guess that's all I've been experienced. I mean, effectively, the Future League is a curated cube experience, I guess. But I have gotten a lot of satisfaction with constructed environments, which were limited sets, as long as they were fresh enough or a weird enough combination that there wasn't anything standard to turn to. I remember I had one event where I competed against Finkel, John Finkel. It was some sort of, I forget why it was being promoted, but we both were able to construct using Ice Age, which was many years past, and some other things. And so we each brought our own deck, and he cleaned my clock. But I actually went into it with an interesting sort of cheaty meta strategy, which was I really focused on making my deck anti-blue.
Right.
And just gambled on it being blue. And my reason was why I was cheaty, because I since they were planning to sell this product afterwards, I knew if I didn't hit, that they'd have to redo the deck. And so I'd have to get something. So I took my shot and I failed because he didn't go blue because he anticipated that. And so anyway.
So when you in the past you've been getting back into Magic for whatever reason, working for Wizards or something else, you said you've gone and made a cube. What is the process like for you of putting together a new cube in the past when you've done it?
Well, I'm usually working with mechanics that interest me. I don't put a lot of science into it. I like to mix. I mean, it's not quite grabbing a bunch of random cards and making the cube, but it's not that far off. I like to be surprised, but then we do it a bunch of times so you get familiar with this environment, and so yeah, it's not deeply science. I'm not trying to create an experience beyond having a bunch of cards that I like and a bunch of random stuff that appeals to me, and making sure the colors are reasonably equally distributed.
That is really validated to hear, because we get a lot of people that want to design cubes that listen to the show, or cube designers that are working on their first ever cube list, and our advice is always just think less. Just get some cards together, start playing the game, and let it grow from there. Because I think a lot of people have this perception that to design a cube is this monumental creative task that requires a bunch of time and effort, and you have to choose your archetypes and balance everything perfectly. And our point has always just been Magic is just fun. Drafting is fun. You can have the cube be totally out of balance, or kind of weird in a couple of ways, and it's not going to be not fun, especially the first time, and then you can just learn from lessons from there. So really validating to hear you say a similar thing.
No, pretty much that's totally my philosophy, which is that it's going to be fun once. And will it be of enduring interest? Will it be worth playing more than once? Usually more than once, but it's not going to be up to something which somebody who's experienced has put a lot of work into. But I find that it's often just easier to put together a new cube when that one's run its course. It's one of my pet peeves in modern game design, which I think we're clearly in a golden age of game design.
Oh,
and
for sure.
I love the work that's going on both in digital and in paper. But one of my pet peeves is overdevelopment of games. And the thing is that I've sat down so many times to these games where I feel like I can't get my teeth into it, and it feels like it's mechanically all there, but it doesn't speak to me. And you talk to the developers, and they've had a great time with the game, and they talk about all the broken things they went through in the past, and that sounds like a lot of fun.
Oh, interesting.
But what's left has been sort of shined down so that it doesn't really feel like and it's really easy to see in a game like Slay the Spire is quite good. you can get amazing combos going pretty early, and there's a lot of fun to explore. But there are roguelikes that when you start picking cards, they all kind of feel balanced, and they're really hard to get the combos going. And I think what's going on there almost always is that if you're an expert at the game, which their playtesters have been, they've been playtesting it for 2 years or whatever, it works for them because if you make it a more pronounced combo, it's broken from their perspective.
Right.
And so anyway, the process of development can often be a process of removing the fun. And so there's a balance. And so then the reason why that came up with cubes, of course, is because it's fun playing a broken cube. Once, twice, 10 times, I don't know. And I like playing broken systems for some limited amount of time. That doesn't remove when you're a total expert at a game, you might want something a little more refined.
So listener, if you ever needed a reason to put that pet card in your cube, even if you think it might be a little too powerful, I think Richard Garfield is giving you permission fully to just put that card in for a couple of drafts. The thing I always find is that with a cube, you can do it once, and if it is fun that first time because you're exploring, but you can see pretty clearly if there's going to be some problems in terms of repetitive play patterns or a dominant strategy, you just change the cube a little bit, and then the next time is still the first time in a sense, and you just kind of keep iterating in that way, and that's what I think a lot of cube design comes down to.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We actually had a question written down here specifically about power level, because something that is kind of a hallmark of most cube designers and most cube design is people are seeking that relatively flat power level you were kind of alluding to with these roguelikes where all the cards seem to be, more or less just as good as all the other cards, which, people I think say they seek that because, retail limited is often marked by some bomb rares that are almost unbeatable, and then, some last pick cards that are just not going to get played in any deck ever. And as cube designers often look at that and see that as kind of missed opportunity. Like, well, why have these huge outliers that are really powerful and these cards that are really bad when we can just make everything really good? And this does seem to be in contrast with at least the spirit in which Magic was initially designed, right? Like Alpha obviously had wild power outliers. You're talking about actual power, ancestral recall, that kind of stuff. Plus, unplayable, like little dinky creatures that, it's hard to imagine what they would even do in a game. I'm curious if you could speak to just the virtues of a broader power level band in any kind of game.
This is a moving target. That is, the more sophisticated your players are, the more the outlier will disturb their experience. Like, one thing about the early Magic, which had lots of power outliers, as you say, there actually wasn't a lot of power outliers from the perspective of new players back then, because playing was so unsophisticated, or at least they thought that the things were powerful, they misattributed power to the wrong cards.
There have been stories of people trading their Moxen for Crawlworm, right? Like, Crawlworm's a 6/6. Why would I want this card that's just a bad land?
6/4?
Oh, is it maybe? See, you're quizzing me here. But there's stories of that where people were trading their Moxen where they were like, well, this is just a land. Why do I want a different land when I can have a big creature in my deck? So, yeah, I think you're definitely right.
And so this actually goes back to this idea of developing out the fun in some ways. It wasn't until, I don't know, maybe around the Pro Tour so for several years I could go to any card store and play their champions, and I would beat, I don't know, 95% of them, and I'm not a great player. I'm a pretty good player, and I'm a pretty good deck maker, but I'm not great. But I was beating them with all common cards. All right, and it wasn't that I didn't know that you couldn't make a first turn kill deck with Moxes and Lotuses and all that other stuff. It's just the fact that those decks weren't out there, and people just throwing in random rare cards and thinking they had a good deck, and I would beat them with bears and giant growths.
Anthony's heart just skipped a beat when you said that, I'm sure. Anthony is a big fan of bears and giant growths, so a big smile on his face.
A lot of people don't
here.
like giant growth. I feel like I think it's a pretty good part of the boon cycle, personally.
So I've been asked whether if going back I would change those cards, and the answer is I would change some of them, but for the most part, all the ones I would change would be things like Raging River, because who the hell knows what that does.
Now you're making Andy smile. Known Raging River.
I love that card. I love that card because it's so confusing. There's nothing better than being in a commander game and attacking and being like, now choose a side of the river. Choose a side of the river to your opponent.
I mean, it is a challenging card, but it has such a compelling narrative that it is really funny to sit down and have to explain to somebody that they have to choose a side of the river.
It's a classic one of those cards that it works in spirit perfectly, and then when you actually write down all the rules text to like cover all the edge cases, it's like an animate dead situation, right? Like it works very simply if you just get the vibes, but the actual minutia of the rules gets a little complicated.
Yeah. But suppose I went back and fixed Ancestral Recall. I don't know, made it, what do you have to make it cost? Cost 7, or maybe make it so that it just draws 2 cards and cost 5, or
I mean, it's 1 banana, Michael. What could it cost? $10?
Or whatever.
Sure.
Whatever the in quote correct cost is. What if I had done that back then? Would it have been a better environment for the players? And the answer is pretty clearly no, because they didn't appreciate it at 1, right? And so it would have made the environment worse for those players, which is, most of them. And then once players got sophisticated enough to sort of understand the concept of card advantage and so forth, then Magic's in this great position where we can actually change the cards that are available. But another game would have to do a patch or change the rules or something like that. But I think it's really important to develop as much as possible for your early game audience, and not your end game audience. But as your early game audience shifts, that will shift. So I think it's completely inappropriate today, because people joining the game are much more sophisticated with probably gameplay in general, but certainly with gameplay of Magic.
Whenever somebody tries to look back retroactively and talk about like how they would have changed Alpha or whatever, I'm always like, first of all, it's really hard for you to even wrap your head around the context in which that game was released, because you're speaking from the perspective of a game where trading card games exist and, the world is just very different. But also, like, the game was wildly successful for a good reason, right? Like, yes, we wouldn't print Ancestral Recall today, but to your point, I think it was critically important to have these exciting cards that actually even still took people a while to realize how good they were, is part of the story of the game, which this idea that you're describing of modern games sometimes being overdeveloped is so compelling to me, where you talk to the developers and they went through all these phases of like, we had this broken card for a while and this broken mechanic for a while, and then we realized we had to get rid of it. And they're kind of on the journey of the actual fun game, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Experiencing that stuff is actually the fun. And they're like, kind of almost like the sea, like turns a piece of glass into a round little rock with like nothing sharp. They're just wearing everything down, so it's all smooth edges. I feel like I've definitely played cubes like that, where I sit down to draft and I'm like, okay, well, look at my pack one, pick one, and all these cards are like, they're all
You're
just
never
as
going to
good.
be punished. It's always going to be fine.
Yeah, they're all just very good, fine cards, but there's like nothing that really jumps out at me one way or another. And I think a lot of those cube designers went through a similar process where they had cards in there for a while that turned out to be, problematic or that didn't meet their eventual, design goals. But I think it's so easy to forget that if you want to draft a cube with new people, they haven't had that whole experience to inform each draft.
Yeah, absolutely. And to those players who have those very, very well balanced cubes, that might be perfect for them, because people who have been along that journey, they're basically able to appreciate the nuances more, and so that's okay. If I put in on these roguelikes that were overbalanced, if I put in, I don't know, a month of play or something like that, I might be to the point where I sort of begin to appreciate the subtlety and whatever they're offering me. But it would be more fun if I had gone on that journey.
You want to cast a couple Ancestral Recalls first. That's the fun part.
Yeah, that's exactly right. No, it's possible to do that sort of thing where you. I personally, I think the formula which has been presented by Slay and others, where it is broken, it's broken, but you just increase the difficulties. Now that works well for single player games.
Right.
But it's a different challenge when you're actually expecting people to play against each other. So yeah, one of my favorite examples of illustrations of this thinking and development is I did this game with a Belarusian Alexei Stankovich called Spectromancer. And in Spectromancer, there were, I think, 6 different character classes you could play. So there was a priest and a necromancer and so forth. And the priest was free, and each of the other ones cost a couple bucks, I think. And it was a dueling game. So there was a lot of complaints that the priest was the worst class. And this was expected because it was free. But I did know we didn't choose it to be the worst. We chose it because it was it highlighted a lot of the different mechanics. It was a very flexible power. And so being a digital game, we could actually run statistics on it. And what we found was really interesting to me, that the priest was actually worse for beginners. It won like 45% of the time. But for experts, they won about 55% of the time. And in retrospect, it was obvious why, is because it is flexible, and flexibility is by its nature skill testing. So then another one, power, Necromancer, people said it was broken. Well, for beginners, it was winning 55%. They were right. It was at the limits of what we found acceptable. But experts, 45%. It was powerful, but when you knew how to play around it, it actually became worse than other powers. And so then you're confronted. In the end, we had these 6 classes, and some of them were powerful for beginners, some for advanced players. And the answer to this is definitely not the modern game development. I think a lot of players would say, oh, Necromancer wins 45% for experienced players. We should make it more powerful to get it up to 50%. But that's going to make the environment even worse for beginners.
And then you have no more experienced players because all the beginners had a terrible time and they left.
Anyway, I love that because that illustration because it sort of shows how there can be room for all that stuff, and that one person's broken stuff is another person's perfectly legitimate stuff.
Yeah, I feel like I've gone through a little bit of a similar process with my own cube where over time, it isn't really that fun to get beaten by the same power outlier every time, so things have kind of gotten cut and smoothed out. And it did get to a point where it's like, I really did enjoy casting that cast Dissident Mage when it was a little bit overpowered, which is, it's not an accident then that one of the next cubes I designed was much lower power, but then had a big stack of these weird overpowered cards, and I was just like, we're going to shuffle in a couple of these before the draft and see how it goes. And it's been an interesting and kind of mixed experience playing that cube.
It's a fascinating area balancing these things, and it's like, and it's easy for me to say the fun's been developed out, but you do have to have it such that once you master the game, you don't feel like you're done with it. Also,
right.
So it is a challenge.
I'm curious. Do you have any advice for cube designers who are figuring out how to process feedback from their players? I imagine you've done a lot of this over your long career of game design. How do you approach getting feedback from playtesters?
Well, I can tell you how I process feedback from playtesters in general. I'm not sure whether it translates to cube design, though.
Yeah, let's take it in general.
So in general, I find that playtesters are always saying something which is valid, but they're often using they're often not saying the right words to communicate that. And that's because they know something's wrong, or they know something's right, but they don't actually know what it is. And so they often, will say, for instance, the game's too long. Maybe the game isn't too long. Maybe it's, there's a mechanic in it which isn't compelling enough. And if you tweak that, it would carry the length of the game just right. Sure.
Could just be there's a boring lull in the middle, not that it's too long, just that it's too long for how much it's keeping people engaged.
So whenever, and sometimes they'll say things which are objectively wrong, like this particular card is broken or this mechanic is broken, and you've played with better players and it's not broken, but that doesn't invalidate their experience of apparently frustration that they can't see a way around that. And so it's easy to cross that off your list as not being interesting, but it is interesting. It should be interesting if you're interested in that audience. And so I spend a lot of time listening to what my players say, and then put some effort into often trying to figure out where I don't think they're correct, what they're actually saying, or a way to handle what they're saying without disrupting what I'm after.
I want to say it's either friends of ours, Dinrovahar or Deinonychus. I want to say Deinonychus. I'm sorry if I'm getting this wrong, but they've, I think, made a great little metaphor to a doctor, like a physical doctor, where they're like, it's, the player's job to like give you their symptoms, right? And tell you like what hurts and, what they feel and, what they're experiencing. And it's your job to like turn that into a diagnosis, right? You don't expect your patients to walk in off the street and, diagnose themselves with a specific ailment or disease or whatever. They're just supposed to tell you what they're feeling, and then you have sort of the knowledge to navigate that in between space and turn those symptoms into like something that actually has an explanatory root cause.
That is a much more elegant way to say exactly what I was trying to say. So that is exactly correct. That is perfect. Yeah, and then it can be misleading when the patient is going in and saying that they think they've got something in particular, and
right.
It's like
when they've been on WebMD, they're going to be a problematic patient. They're like, I've got this disease, I figured it out because of I woke up with a headache, and sometimes overinformed patients or overinformed players. I actually do find sometimes that other cube designers are sometimes the least helpful players of a cube in terms of giving feedback, because they jump right to their proposed solution instead of just describing what their actual experience was,
Yeah, so in that sense, I guess that respect for what the symptoms are and trying to deal with it is what I try to do with playtesters in general, and maybe that is applicable in the same way to cubes.
So I'm curious about your own design process a little bit, and famously, some of the sort of core concepts of Magic coalesced while you were out on a nature walk, and you've mentioned other articles that you go on regular walks. Is that part of your design process? Is sort of like getting out in nature and experiencing different things important? Or is it just generally important for you to just take a step away from your desk and have space to think about things? Those are important. I don't consciously, go on design walks or anything like that. But when I go on a walk, I will often be mulling over design issues I'm having. But I find to be productive, thinking about different things, which involves, reading a wide variety of different books, watching movies, playing games from all over the place, reading scientific articles, whatever, is like that variety is all grist for the mill. And that when you're doing something else, whatever those things are, that often can lead to insight into whatever you're mulling over. I've been asked a lot of times what the most important, whether math is important for game design and what the most important subject is. And my answer is generally that that is all important. And in the same way that when you're a writer, it's all important. You write about what interests you, and the more interests you have, the more subjects you have to write about. And it's the same thing with game design. The more things that interest you, the more that will reflect itself in your games. Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. It's like writing is not just about writing. Writing is about connecting to other experiences.
It's
and I've never
about writing.
Thought about it in these same terms, but game design is not just about games. It's about translating all these other experiences into experiences that you're sharing with other people.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I never anticipate, when I never go into something thinking I'm going to get inspired here. I just I have a wide variety of stimuli and interests, and things come up.
Yeah, absolutely. Related to that, I mean, Magic is so compelling because of the game design elements, but it's also really compelling just as a visual and narrative experience. Is that something that you put a lot of emphasis on in all of your game designs?
Yes. There's my hesitancy there is because there's often confusion between the world you're building with a game and traditional narrative. And I'm usually very picky and often disinterested in narrative, but I'm very interested in having a colorful, broad world. I like to see the world as being where the players are acting and that they are the ones making the narrative rather than there being a story which they're reflecting in some way. So you can have a great Lord of the Rings game, of course, but it is a challenge making it true and keeping a balance with the prescribed narratives that are already there. And if you do that too hard, you pull agency away from the players, which is where I like to see it.
Sure. So it's more important to use sort of aesthetics to build context and sort of like an aesthetic space for players to drive the narrative.
Yes, yes, and so oftentimes a lot of the games I don't work exclusively with games that are high variance, very swingy, lots of luck, but I do use that as a tool, and it does appear in a lot of my games. And when that's the case, I usually like to make the flavor be kind of cartoony, just because I want players' first early experiences with it to be something which puts them in a playful frame of mind rather than a serious frame of mind. Because I don't, if something goes against them and they get punished through mechanics they didn't understand, or that randomly went against what they were trying to do. It makes a big difference if they were coming at this like chess versus if they were coming at it like poker. And so I find oftentimes a playful, more cartoony environment will help with those games. And so in that way, I usually like to have it so whatever world or flavor is there is reflective of the mood I want people to approach the game with.
Right, that makes so much sense. And I guess also to make sure that the right sort of people are self-selecting for the kind of experience that you're creating.
Yeah, that is true too.
I remember growing up, we used to always be told, don't judge a book by its cover. And I feel like increasingly, as I've grown up, just realized, well, the cover's designed for a reason. It's designed to communicate something about who's the audience for this. So maybe you should judge a book by its cover a little bit.
You should certainly weigh it. Yeah, that's true.
This explains why Munchkin is so silly.
Yeah, exactly.
Boy, that game is really punishing in terms of just random awful stuff happening all of a sudden that you couldn't have predicted. And I guess they get away with it because of the cute little weirdo characters.
No, that's a great illustration of it. If that game were, there's no reason why it couldn't be. It could be done with sort of a very serious theme of dungeon exploration or something like that. And yeah, it would be completely wrong, I think.
Yeah, everything you were saying about the relationship between narrative and games just really put me in mind of Dungeons and Dragons again, which I think does a really good job of giving you a setting, a context, a toolkit for which players can interact with the narrative, but overall is much less prescriptive with narrative than a lot of other games are, because you're inherently kind of playing this improvisational space and inhabiting a character and making creative choices about that character and their actions, which I think Dungeons and Dragons handles that kind of narrative a lot better than a game like Magic. I mean, I love Magic. I've always felt like it was kind of a strange game to try and tell stories through because of the inherent chopped up nature of a trading card game. And you see cards at different times and there's no real control over order necessarily. So it's really just more about presenting a world and letting people kind of find their own stories in that space.
Yeah. In fact, that was very early on when we were trying to figure out how best to do stories in the world which Magic was representing, with Antiquities, so the second expansion. We thought of this idea that since you can't get things in the order, maybe you're more like archaeologists and you're uncovering things. When you're an archaeologist, you don't find things in the order they happened, or you have to sort of assemble the narrative. And so I found that view of it very appealing and very appropriate for a trading card game, that rather than reading a story from beginning to end, you're more like an archaeologist, sort of discovering and trying to piece together how it exactly works.
I think I remember hearing you say a very similar thing on an episode of Drive to Work with Mark Rosewater, and thinking that that's such a compelling way to handle the narrative in a game like Magic, and it just made me wish that I had the experience of, being a kid when Antiquities came out, and maybe wish I hadn't experienced that, by looking at Scryfall in the past, or in the future rather, which is how I actually did experience that set. It's just a really compelling way, I think, to handle the narrative. One thing that I think about a lot is that cube design is really designing a meta and, a whole context. You mentioned earlier the idea of, people taking a cube but using it as a sort of jumping off point for constructed, like designing their own card pool for people to build constructed decks from. And this obviously is its closest analog, aside from the Future League or whatever, is the earliest days of Magic playtesting with you and your friends in the UPenn library, and you kind of just printing out crude playtest cards and making changes on the fly, and all the stories we've heard in many other interviews and podcasts and whatnot. And I'm just curious to know if you think about designing a meta different than designing a game, or if it's all kind of one continuous thing for you.
I see meta design as something separate, but when you're doing the base design, you're putting out the tools for an interesting meta, and you often don't know. I like to design in such a way that I don't know how that's going to go. So I don't. If I take a step back, if you have a rich game, it's got lots of different sort of balance inflection points, you're going to have a meta, and the journey to finding that will be interesting. And the question is whether the final meta that players find will be interesting in an enduring way, or is it going to be, one deck or one play style or one strategy is going to dominate. And so I try to make a rich play environment with lots of different things to shoot for, and then as we explore it, try to temper the evolving metas so that usually sometimes that's making it so that a particular strategy are toning down so that it doesn't dominate, but much more often I find that it's about taking a mechanic which isn't representative enough in how people are playing and try to bring it out. Like oftentimes I'll have a play test where there's a bunch of cards thrown together. I don't know exactly how it's going to work, and we begin playing, and there was this one card that was played that people will say, oh, well, that would have been kind of interesting if this happened, and you realize, yeah, it would. And so that'll account for 25% of the card change will be about bringing that mechanic out, which will introduce it to a broader meta.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's always struck me that I think cube design is somewhere between designing a game and also designing a meta, and thinking about okay, if my playgroup thinks that this color is too powerful, then I'm just going to put a couple cards in here, these other colors that are going to bring that into balance, and taking the direct feedback of your known local situation into consideration and making design choices. So yes, I think you spoke well to how those design considerations are different. Well, this has been great. I don't want to take your whole day from you, so I did want to end on, though, I'm just curious to know, you play a ton of games, famously, and as evidence in this conversation, I think we'll just end on what some of your favorite games you're playing right now are.
Oh, I always try to balance playing new stuff against playing stuff I love. And with so much new stuff out there and so much curiosity about it, and being an innovator at heart, it's hard often to pull myself to the games I know I love, but I discipline myself to do that. And one of the reasons for that is because really games are such a wonderful art, science, I never know what to call it.
A little both.
And because the good ones get better and better the more you engage in them. And so it's sort of knowing that it's sort of obviously a bad idea to invest yourself completely into the new stuff. So in answer to that, the classic game, the games that I've played for a long time, that I'm still playing currently. One of them is Innovation by Carl Chudik. I love that game. And it plays great with 2 players, and it's got a lot of crazy, wacky combos in it. And digitally, there's this game. Have you ever heard of the game Quadradius?
I have not.
Okay, so the game is just I don't know. It's my favorite digital board game easily. Now that is a pretty qualified statement, but it's totally true. Now, is it my favorite digital game? I'm not sure. It's in the top 10. Is it my favorite board game? I don't know. It's very high up there. It hasn't been available for a long time because it was made back like, I don't know, 2008 or something. And it was around for, I don't know, 6 years or something. And then they shut it down, and somebody's recently put it up again. So it's totally free. And it was shut down because the designer wasn't really able to make a financial go of it. But the idea of Quadradius is that each side has this set of checkers, quads, and they can move 1 square each turn. And if they land on an enemy quad, they destroy them. And you're playing until you wipe out the other side. Now, at that point, the game would be a complete stalemate. But the heart of the game is that every 7 turns, there's a bunch of power-ups that spawn randomly in the game. And when you pick those power-ups, you don't know what they do. When you pick them up, it'll tell you what they do. And there's like, I don't know, 100 different power-ups. And they range from being virtually useless to really, really good. And when you pick them up, your opponent doesn't know what you've got. But so it allows you very quickly, you learn, a lot of this game is going to be determined by bluffing, because they'll have a valuable quad, one that's picked up some good power-ups, and you'll move one of your quads that has a power, and he'll move it away. And even though your power is garbage, you just cost them a turn, and you realize, I can manipulate my opponent. And anyway, by the way, and the game is area control. It's not, it looks like a combat game, but it's area control. And the reason for that is because the more area you have, the more these power-ups come to you.
Right.
And there is just so much going on in the game. It is so crazy, so wacky, so many combos. The first time anyway, I'm very happy to have found it in the last month, and have been playing it a lot. So those are the games I've played a lot that I'm playing currently. As far as new games,
That's a great answer as far as I'm concerned. I can't wait to try this game out. So I think that's a perfect answer.
Yeah, I can't think of any new games right now that I'm
totally fine
going on. My brain has been eaten by Quadradius again, so that's dominating.
It's funny. I googled it, and the first result is your review of it on Board Game Geek. So we'll link to that in the show notes as well.
I said that'd be the last question, but I got to sneak one more in, because we are starting to do like book reviews, book club kind of style thing on the show. And I was curious if you had one book you'd recommend that was particularly informative to your game design life, or you think would be interesting to talk about for people like cube designers that are interested in game design.
Well, I'll throw out a couple of the books I really like in game design. I'm not sure what they'll say to a cube designer. Gamut of Games by Sid Saxon was written, I don't know, 70s maybe. Anyway, it contains a number of original games by him, but also talks about tweaking games and games that he didn't design but really liked and maybe modified in some way. And so this was very informative to me, because it really reflects. You read it, you understand his love for games broadly. And that's something I've always appreciated. It's not about his games; it's about games as a universe.
Right.
And so I really like that book. I learned a lot from it. And another one is new rules for classic games. And I think that's Schnittberger. I might get the name wrong. Anyway, that one also does a sort of similar thing. Came a little later, but it also it's more overtly about taking old games and modifying the rules or the way you play them. So, and of course, as you can tell from our conversation, that would speak to me a lot.
Yeah. Well, amazing. We'll put links to all those in the show notes for people that want to check them out. I know I'm going to check them out. This has been a great conversation, Richard. Thank you for giving us, a couple hours on your Saturday morning there. It means a lot.
Well, you're welcome. It's been a lot of fun.
Well, you're welcome back anytime. If you ever, are dying to talk about games with somebody, I know you've probably got a lot of people in your life you can talk about games with, but we're always here thinking about and talking about Cube and games more broadly.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
And that brings us to the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. Thanks everybody for tuning in. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by thinking really hard about Magic cards and then speaking into microphones about it. Thanks to both of you for making this happen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Richard. I feel like I've learned so much. This has just been a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate it.
No, I enjoyed it. It was it was a good conversation. I do enjoy talking about this stuff, and yeah.